As we have discussed in the previous lecture, German industrialization was plagued in the 18th century with largely three different problems. One was the fragmentation of the economy of German lands into cluster of several small regional economies. Second was the problem of labor and its being restricted by the system of servitude that existed. And the third was the dearth of capital. As we have tried to argue that in course of the French and the Napoleonic intervention in the course of German history, in the beginning in the 1790s, continuing till around 1815, much of the problem to do with the immobility of labor was taken care of because either reforms generated by Napoleon or by reforms that were undertaken in order to stave off any major social revolution or social revolutionary situation. The problem of immobility of labor and guild restrictions had been taken care of by the time that Napoleon fell from power. The other problem of the size of the market remained, although the dimension of the problem had reduced somewhat. So Germany had been the German lands had been reduced to a number of 13 different states as against more than 300 odd states before the French intervention had begun. So we will start by taking a look at how the beginning of modernization sort of hits German industrial sector in the 1830s. What happened was that at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, in the Vienna Congress, it had been decided that for the contribution Prussia made in the defeat of Napoleon, Prussia was going to be rewarded. And what was the reward? Well, Prussia, being an expanding state which required more and more industrial resources, it was decided would be rewarded with Rhineland. Rhineland was to become a part of the Prussian state. Previously, as you will remember, it was divided into a set of principalities, small states, city-states. This entire region which Napoleon had turned into the Confederation of the Rhine was now going to become a part of Prussia. For Prussia, the need for Rhineland was partly to do with the industrial resources there and partly with the idea of staving off any major social revolutionary impulse that might be generated in the aftermath of the Napoleonic intervention. But in terms of economy, the significance of Rhineland was still greater. While Silesia had been developed as a promising textile and heavy industrial base, Rhineland had become a very quick double to this. So using both Silesia on the one hand and Rhineland, it would have been ideal for Prussia to go. Problem was that the main kingdom, the kingdom of Brandenburg Prussia, was physically distinct from Rhineland because there were other states that lied in between. If you take a look at the map of Germany today, for instance, you would see that Prussia constitutes the eastern part of the German lands, whereas Rhineland constitutes the western part, with several smaller states in between and even a couple of large states. So the physical distance between Prussia and Rhineland made it very difficult for things to move between the one part of the kingdom to the other. As a consequence, Prussia began to think of a system whereby this need for these internal barriers could be removed. And the experiment that Prussia started with ended up solving the most important problem of German industrialization, that of market integration. The Prussian initiative to create the Zollverein, which basically means customs union, ultimately helped begin the process by which the German economy was integrated into one unit. The series of developments that led to the creation of Zollverein began in 1828 with a treaty ushering in duty-free trade between Prussia and its neighboring state of Hesse-Darmstadt. In 1829, the Palatinate states adjacent to Rhineland also joined in a similar system. In 1828, a separate treaty brought together larger states like Saxony, Thuringia, Nassau, and Hesse into a duty-free trading area. In 1834, all the latter four states, that is Saxony, Thuringia, Nassau, and Hesse, along with the 14 other big and small states, 14 other big and small adjacent states, joined the duty-free arrangement of Prussia and Hesse-Darmstadt. And this marked, in 1834, the completion of the creation of Zollverein. In 1854, Hanover, which had heavy trading ties with Britain, and Oldenburg also joined it. Apart from removing all inward customs barriers, meaning all the signatories who joined the Zollverein had all their internal barriers removed. So the signatories, merchandise from one signatory state to another, would not have to pay any transit or customs duty to each other, provided it was passing through the lands of other signatories. And there was one other thing in common that began to emerge. This was a high tariff wall was thrown up when the Zollverein proposed that Prussian manufacturers would be given preferential treatment. Prussian and manufacturers of signatories would be given preferential treatment. A large number of small states and entrepreneurs based in those small states were actually eager to join the Zollverein, because the high tariff wall would keep British merchandise out of their markets. And by creating the Zollverein, it was becoming theoretically possible for merchandise raised in one part of the Zollverein area to be sold in a different part. So even states like Hanover and Oldenburg, which had very deep commercial ties with countries like Britain, were keen on joining Zollverein in order to keep British merchandise out to save their own domestic industry. Among the states that did not join the Zollverein, the most important state was Austria. And Austria's argument was that the tariff wall that the Zollverein had decided upon was not high enough to keep British manufacturers out of the Austrian market. So Austria tried to throw up tariff barriers higher than even what the Zollverein had designated in order to safeguard its own industry. As a result, it did not join the Zollverein. Among the other states, such as the North German states, which had deeper commercial ties with Britain, the argument for not joining the Zollverein had been that this would keep British merchandise out, which was the mainstay of their economy. So the port cities of Hamburg and Bremen remained outside the Zollverein area for a very long time. In 1867, as the prospect for a united German state under Prussian leadership grew brighter, North German states such as Mecklenburg, Schleswig-Holstein, Lauenburg, and Lübeck joined the Zollverein. In 1871, at the time of the foundation of the German Reich, only Hamburg and Bremen remained outside it. After even those two port cities joined the Zollverein, all the German lands, apart from Austria, became integrated into a single market. So from a cluster of 300 odd markets in the late 18th century to a cluster of 39 regional economies in the 1830s to one single integrated market in the heart of Europe. That's basically the story of Zollverein turning German economy into one integral unit. Considerable developments took place in the 18 years between 1830 and 48 in the realm of riverine and road transport. Apart from numerous new roads that were built, canals were dug out of rivers like the Rhine, the Oder, the Elbe to facilitate cheap river transport. But probably the real breakthrough, as argued by historians like Hoffmann, came with rail transport. During 1835 to 40 period, there were only 679 railway kilometers of the railway network. In the 1840s, it increased to 6,000 kilometers, which is basically growth by a factor of 100. The need to a factor of 10, sorry. The need to cater to greater demand of the expanded market space propelled German industry to modern industrial technology, because more and more mileage was being added to the German railway network. More and more rails had to be manufactured, wagons had to be built, engines had to be built, more and more coal was required to power the blast furnaces, as also the railroad. So this generated German industry into an arena where the market demand has grown so much that in order to be able to produce up to that level, to cater to that demand, German industry had to innovate, had to adopt modern industrial technology. As the coal and iron industries of Silesia, Rhine and the Ruhr began to adopt modern technology, the general character of entire industrial conurbations began to change. The realization that the development of transport and communication would further expand the market horizons encouraged wealthy banking concerns like the Rothschild and Bethmann in Frankfurt am Main, in Schickler in Berlin, and Heine in Hamburg to come forth and invest in railways. But historians like Gerschenkron and Clapham, among others, believe that 1830 to 48 was not so much the takeoff stage as the precondition of the takeoff stage, meaning they believe the German Industrial Revolution did not really begin in 1830 or 48. It was the time when the vestiges of the impediments were being cleared. They argue this because that despite the onset of mechanization in heavy industry and other associated industries, a large segment of German industrial production continued to remain within the traditional artisanal mold. And Gerschenkron argues that this was largely because that in spite of the end of servitude, the mobility of German labor continued to remain very restricted. As late as 1848, Gerschenkron would argue that a heavy degree or a large number of German people continued to derive their sources of livelihood from agriculture. This changed only with the agrarian crisis of 1848. Gerschenkron argues that once the agrarian crisis of the 40s began to sort of assume catastrophic proportions in 1848, a large section of German people, German peasantry, just as in France, decided to leave their moorings in agriculture and move towards industrial conurbations and seek a livelihood in industry. It was at this stage, Gerschenkron argues, that the real breakthrough began. In the French case, as we would see later in the Russian case, the real problem of capital mobilization was removed with state participation. State, therefore, was the real substituting factor. The state generated its demands, the state mobilized capital in order to help the economy industrialize. In the German case, however, the state did not play that substitution role because the state did not exist. There was no one single German state. So in absence of a single German state, in absence of political political unity, the German economy had its substitution effect being provided by private sources of capital. And the story of German Industrial Revolution, Gerschenkron and others would argue, is the story of how the German banks stepped forth and through a series of innovations changed the face of German industrial landscape. While there were 300 states and then there were 39 states with their own different currencies, one has to understand that in each and every major German city, there had to be a local bank which was capable of changing the money, changing currency. If you come from Bavaria to Prussia, the first thing you look for is a bank where you can change your Bavarian currency into Prussian currency, and for just about all the others. So these money changers and bankers, they were the people who had some ready cash. Now these people would occasionally tend to invest in some industrial venture. Some people would invest in agriculture. Some people would invest in long distance commerce. The very good best examples are Rothschild, who invested heavily in long distance commerce. Fuggers invested in iron industry, in copper industry. So almost in all parts of Germany, in all the major cities, there were local banks who would have therefore the money to invest if investment was required in a small scale, who would have the resources to influence government decisions if required, and most importantly, they would have the vision that would require them to have extended relationship with the people, with the communities they worked with. So what happened in the German case was that these banks, which began essentially as money changers and lenders to the state, and also investors in small industrial, stepped forth in 1848, in the period beginning 1840s, but most significantly after 1848, in order to invest in industrial ventures that would help them develop their market horizons and that would help them flourish. So if commerce dictated the need for transport, a modernized and advanced transport sector, money had to be poured in. For the bankers to pour in the money, they needed to know that there was profit in it. Now, if the market was gradually integrating under the Zollverein, it was very clear that market would be integrated and the volume of commerce that would therefore be generated. If money is put in transport system, the transport system would be able to sort of bring returns on the money, which would be far higher than what they would get simply by lending it to some small producer or a small state. So the German bankers began to invest their surplus capital in this respect. The problem, however, was that in case of small banks, the capital outlay was required to be large, but their capital stock was much smaller, because small banks, their small stock of capital is what makes them small. So the Germans began with a series of experiments in the financial sector, derived partly from the experience of the French and the Belgians, but the Germans developed these into art form. For instance, to mobilize huge capital required for railway build-up, the Germans followed the model proposed by Société Générale de Belgique, a Belgian bank, in resorting to joint stock banking. The small German banks pooled their resources together, invested in banking concerns, invested in industrial concerns, and thereby they managed to overcome this problem of paucity of capital. The first bank of this type came in 1848, named as the Schaffenhausen'scher Bankverein in Cologne, with the objective of investing in the coal and iron industry of Rhineland-Westphalia. In 1844, again in Cologne, was founded the Bank für Handel und Industrie zu Darmstadt, aimed at investing railways and modern industrial ventures. The Diskontogesellschaft was founded in 1856 in Berlin with similar objectives. Gradually, more and more German financial firms began to invest in industry rather than simply commerce, such as the Mitteldeutsche Kreditbank, the Leipziger Anstalt, and Berliner Handelsgesellschaft. By 1870, the greatest concentration of capital in the continent of Europe could be seen in German lands. Now, availability of capital accelerated the pace of German industrialization. Mechanization of industrial sector began to grow apace as more and more factories began to emerge along capitalist lines of production, given the greater capital endowments. In 1850, the railway network spread across 6,000 kilometers. By 1875, it covered 21,000 kilometers. Generally, investment of social overhead capital tends to be undertaken by governments because it has high gestation period. Profits come only afterwards. In the German case, the banks kept the state out of it, and they developed the principle of Kommandite banking, which basically meant that the German banks, when they invested in a company, would share both profit and loss and in return they would be given operational control. So what is to be done with the money would be decided by a board in which the bank would be represented. So the bank controlled rather than simply lent the money and sat back and derived the interest from it. The development of railways in the German lands then brought about a holistic transformation of the character of the economy. The accelerating demands for railway wagons, rails, engines required progressive increase in production capacity of German iron, steel and coal industries, which propelled the modernization of these sectors. These were basically therefore backward linkages, meaning demands generated by the creation of a particular industry for that particular industry to be created. So in order to have a modern railway transport network, the Germans needed to mechanize and modernize their heavy industrial sector. The German railways, just like British textiles, textile industry in case of the British Industrial Revolution, also generated some forward linkages. Because once the railway network was in place, it was easier to transport merchandise from any part of Germany to any other. So not simply textile or iron and steel, but all merchandise began to cross the barriers of local market. This also meant that all the local industries which had so far been catering only to the local market now had to compete with other industries in other parts of Germany. So their market horizon also had to expand and they also had to modernize in order to survive and expand. As a consequence, the forward linkages generated by the railways turned out to be very significant. And this is the reason why Gerschenkron and Clapham argue that ultimately the takeoff took place in 1850 and 1870. The transformation that happens then comes with a full-fledged support of the German government after German unification, and logically it should have accelerated the course of the industrial development. But very curiously, only 2 years after the German political unification took place, the market integration having already taken place beforehand, the German industry grew at a very fast rate for only a few years, and then it began to move into what was then taken to be a period of depression. It later came out, it was not actually a period of depression, but a matter of retarded growth, a phase of retarded growth in German industry, meaning the economy continued to grow, but at a much slower pace. Because of the character of German development had been such that once depression begins to, or something like a depression begins to appear in the horizon, a major change, a major transformation took place in German industry. In the 1870s, the German industries began to sort of try to regulate this heavy flow of goods in the market by forming cartels. Cartels were something like guilds from the old times, because they ended up by allocating specific production quotas to the various industries that were already in place, so that any industry that had once come into being would not go out of business. And in this manner, the trajectory of growth had to be maintained, the cartels believed, and regulating their resources, regulating production and regulating distribution. It is estimated that in 1890, the cartels dominated 90% of all paper production, 74% of the mines, and 50% of total iron output in Germany. In 1896, as many as 12,000 factories were being regulated by 385 cartels. Another feature of this period was the very interesting virtual cartelization of banking and investment services. Banks and investment services had begun in the 1840s at a time when the industry was growing, and they had sort of invested wherever they thought returns would come. In the 1870s, as the growth horizons began to shrink, they began to be a little more suspicious. They began to be a little more wary. So banks began to develop their own specializations. Thus, from the 1870s, railway investment became the specialization of Darmstadter Bank. It would not invest in any other sector. Diskontogesellschaft began to specialize in iron and steel industry. Berliner Handels invested in heavy industry and in nothing else. In 1913, on the eve of the Great War, Germany had the largest functioning railway network in Europe, 63,700 kilometers. In 1890, Germany produced 89 million tons of coal, which climbed up to 277 million tons in 1913, which, one has to remember, was double the coal output of France, 40 million tons, Russia, 36 million tons, and Austria, 47 million tons put together. In 1914, only Britain, producing 292 million tons, produced more coal than Germany. Britain was the largest producer of iron in the world in 1850. In 1870, on the eve of the birth of United Germany, Britain produced 6 million tons of pig iron, as against 1.3 million tons in the German lands. In 1890s, Britain produced an average of 8 million tons of iron. Germany was producing around 4.9 million and 7.5 million. Look at the manner in which Germany is catching up. In 1910, Britain was producing 10 million tons and Germany 9.5. In 1914, Germany actually surpassed Britain in the production of iron. Germany praised 14 million tons, Britain 11 million tons of iron output. But still more significant was the production of steel. There were some major technological shifts in the 1870s and 80s which took place in Germany, as a result of which Germany was the leader of steel production in Europe. Organizations like Thyssen, Stinnes, Krupp powered German steel production at a remarkable pace. In 1900, British steel production stood at 5 million tons, while German production stood at 6.3 million tons. In 1910, German steel production was 13.6 million tons, which was double that of Britain. German production was 13.6, British production was 6.5. In 1913, German steel output was 17.6 million tons, which was more than the combined steel output of Britain, France, and Russia. In all, on the eve of Great War, 14% of the global steel output came from Germany. The German industry, which had missed the first generation of industrialization, textile industrialization, but had built itself upon the second generation of industrial technology, built around heavy industries and railway buildup, managed to seamlessly lead the third generation of industrial technology, with firms like A.G. Farben and Siemens coming in with the electricals and engineering sector, and with firms like Hext and Bayer emerging to control 90% of the global chemical industry market. As a consequence, Germany in 1914 was the largest economy in Europe and the second largest in the world next to the USA. This, if anything, was a revolution in the industrial sector.